Chapter 2. Theory of Observation. The truck inched toward Victoria Island, boxed in by the heavy, humid crawl of evening traffic that defined the Lagos commute. Tunde glanced over, his hand steady on the steering wheel but his mind still trying to read the man sitting in the passenger seat. "You didn't tell me we were stepping out today," he said, his voice a mix of a question and a quiet observation of the sudden shift in their itinerary. Kene did not look up immediately. Instead, his attention remained fixed on the world outside the window, shifting from one passing scene to the next as the truck moved at a snail's pace. He wasn't looking at the landmarks, but rather reading patterns in the motion, the frantic energy of the loading zones, the messy spill of activity onto the curb, and the synchronized way the roadside workers moved without a single pause in their rhythm. "We are not staying in the office today, Tunde," he said finally, his tone as flat and certain as the horizon. "Call one of your clients right now. We are going to them." Tunde frowned slightly, the logistics of the workday already clashing with this new direction. "Now? In this traffic?" Kene nodded once, the finality of the gesture cutting through any potential argument. "Now. We do not sit in a room and guess what customers want. We go out and we watch it happen in real time." There was a long, expectant pause in the cab before Tunde reached for his phone, balancing the device while trying to keep his eyes on the road, his thumb already scanning through his list of contacts. "Hotel or hospital?" he asked, looking for a target. "The one that feels the most pressure," Kene replied, his voice dropping an octave. "That is where the real wants show themselves." Tunde made the call as the truck crept forward through the heat, briefly confirming they were on the way, and shifting the entire trajectory of the day without any ceremony. No formal meeting had been planned, and no agenda had been printed, but the day was already in motion, dictated by the friction of the city itself. Kene let the silence settle for a moment before speaking again, his voice steady and low against the vibration of the truck. "Today has one mandate," he said, his eyes tracking a delivery bike weaving through the stalled cars. "We answer this." He turned his head slightly, just enough for Tunde to catch the weight of his expression over the hum of the afternoon traffic. "How are customer wants changing right now based on what you directly observe in customer behavior and feedback? And how might these wants evolve over the next 5 years? Tunde nodded slowly, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he repeated the question under his breath, fixing the specific phrasing in his mind like a structural beam. Kene watched him for a beat, then continued, his delivery measured and deliberate. "Customer expectations shift rapidly in this business, Tunde. If you fail to identify these transitions before they become the industry standard, that is how a high-growth firm loses its momentum and its relevance." He paused, his gaze shifting to a hotel laundry van merging into their lane. "This question is a direct order. It forces you to look past the surface and see the raw, real-time feedback from your clients and what you see with your own eyes on the ground. That is where you find the deep operational friction that customers are facing, the kind of gaps that become your next major opportunity to provide value once you solve them." Tunde shifted his grip on the wheel, acknowledging the point with a brief, sharp nod, his eyes locked on the road. "If you ignore this data, you will always be operating at a disadvantage," Kene added, his voice sharpening. "You will find yourself constantly reacting to competitors who were smart enough to see these changes first, and the only way to avoid that is to develop a discipline for how you process the day. To truly build at this level, you must realize that this habit turns every loading bay interaction and every brief exchange with a matron into the most important information you can gather for the company." He leaned toward Tunde, making sure the next words landed with full force. "It allows you to build the exact service that customers actually need, because you are no longer just guessing. This level of insight is what brings real growth. It addresses the actual problems that eat your profit. It builds the kind of loyalty that people who only fight on price can never touch, and it ensures the business stays strong for the long term. And you do all of it by using the information that is already right in front of you." He paused, the cab of the truck falling quiet for a long second, then added quietly, "So today we do not guess. We observe." The anatomy of outcome. The truck edged forward a few feet, then slowed to a stop again in the traffic. Tunde tapped the steering wheel once, then glanced over. "When you say we're looking for wants," he said, "what exactly are we looking for? Because this can start to sound like everything else. Lifestyle, operations, all of it blending together." Kene nodded slightly, as if expecting the question. "It only blends when you don't separate the layers," he said. "Customer wants are about what the customer is trying to get or secure from the outcome of the service. The end state, what they are moving toward. It shows up in what they increasingly value, prefer, or expect to receive, even if they never say it directly." Tunde frowned slightly. "So not what they complain about?" Kene shook his head. "Not first. Complaints are surface, wants are underneath. You see them in choices, reactions, tolerance levels, what they keep returning to. That is demand pulling." He paused, letting it settle. "Now lifestyle, that is different. That is how their broader life is structured. Their routines, time pressure, personal constraints. It explains why their wants are shifting, but it is not the want itself. Tunde nodded once. And how people work. That is the structure of their job, Kene said. Shift timing, coordination, reporting lines, operational flow. It tells you where friction happens in execution, not what they ultimately want out of the service. The truck edged forward again. And technology? Tunde asked. What becomes possible? Kene replied. New capabilities that can change delivery, speed, visibility. That is supply side. It enables the response. It does not define the want. Tunde exhaled slowly, then repeated it under his breath. So wants are the outcome they are trying to secure. Kene nodded. Exactly. Wants are what they increasingly expect or value as an outcome. Lifestyle is the context shaping it. How they work is where they feel it. Technology is what can fulfill it. He glanced toward the loading bay ahead. If we get that wrong, every answer sounds the same. If we get it right, the signal becomes clear. When the truck finally pulled into the hotel loading bay, the supervisor was already waiting, manifest in hand, her expression tense. She and Tunde exchanged the kind of greeting that comes from solving many crises together. He did not move straight into instruction or review. Instead, he let his eyes settle briefly on the carts, the staff movement, the pace of the bay, then asked in a low, neutral tone, "How has it been this week?" It was a simple question, open enough to invite direction without leading it. The supervisor exhaled, shifting her weight slightly as if the answer had been waiting. "Banquet events this weekend exceeded our par levels," she said, leading them toward a cart of stained tablecloths. "And we had pillowcases rejected again, faint staining." As she spoke, a front desk staffer rushed into the bay holding a wrinkled chef's coat, frustration written across his face. "Please tell me the uniforms are back soon," he said. "We have a full dinner service in less than an hour." The supervisor turned to him fully, her voice steady but firm. "Hold on, I'll be with you in a moment," she said, meeting his urgency without absorbing it. He nodded, stepping back toward the side of the bay, still tense but contained. She returned her attention to Tunde without breaking stride, the flow of the environment pulling her forward as much as the conversation itself. Before moving on, the supervisor slowed slightly. Her eyes drifted back toward the cart as if something had just connected. For a moment, she seemed to recall a familiar pattern, something that had happened more than once. She lowered her voice, not out of frustration, but with quiet clarity. "What we really wish existed," she said, "is a small early morning pickup option. Not the full truck, not the whole day's load. Just a handful of linen items we run out of when something unexpected hits us. When a VIP stays longer, or a conference adds extra covers at breakfast, we get caught short. Housekeeping scrambles, managers start calling around, and we end up borrowing sheets from other floors. If there were a way to request a tiny emergency pickup, 5 or 10 items, it would keep our entire morning from collapsing." She paused briefly, as if confirming the thought as she spoke it. "What we want is not more volume," she said. "We want flexibility when the day breaks from plan." Her attention shifted again as another detail surfaced. Her expression tightened slightly, not in reaction, but in recognition. She gestured toward the cart. "There is something else you should see. Guests send their personal garments through us, and we send them out with your team for cleaning before they come back through this same return flow," she said, steady and direct. "There was a mix-up earlier. Guest garments blended with staff uniforms. When that happens, it does not stay contained. Guest items get delayed or returned incorrectly, and staff have to stop what they are doing to sort through it and separate everything again. It slows the entire floor down, and it creates confusion we should not have to manage." She held the moment for a second before continuing. "And what happens now is different. Guests notice faster." Her voice lowered again. "They notice wrinkles. They notice color fade. They go straight to reviews if anything feels off." She held Tunde's gaze for a moment. "What we want is consistency that holds up under scrutiny. Something that does not slip, even under pressure. We cannot afford small misses anymore." As they stepped aside to give the staff room to work, the supervisor turned slightly and gestured for them to follow. "Come," she said. "You should see how it moves when we are under pressure." They fell in behind her as she moved through the loading bay, not explaining, but allowing the work itself to unfold in front of them. Near the entrance, a staff member lifted a stack of folded tablecloths and pulled one out, refolding it carefully because the crease line was uneven. He hesitated, ran his hand across the fabric for a few seconds, then set it aside and reached for another. Tunde watched closely, the movement familiar to him, something he had seen countless times across different client sites, and he felt the need to make it explicit for Kene, who might not recognize what it meant. He waited until the adjustment was complete before speaking. "He is not checking for count," he said quietly. "He is checking for presentation." Kene nodded. "They want items that are ready to use without being questioned." A few steps further, after they had cleared the first cluster of carts, another worker picked up a towel, pressed it lightly between his fingers, then paused. He glanced once toward the stack, then shook his head and placed it back on the cart. "This one feels off," he muttered under his breath before reaching for a different one. The supervisor did not intervene. She only glanced once and kept moving. Tunde noticed it immediately, recognizing the same pattern in a different form, and again chose to call it out so it would not be missed. Kene's eyes followed the motion. "They want consistency you can feel, not just see," he said. The requirement of immediate utility. As they passed through the loading point, Tunde saw the flow opening slightly, his attention suddenly catching one of his own trucks already backed into position, the Swift Clean logo clearly visible along the side. He gave a faint grunt under his breath, registering the timing as the sight of the truck entered his awareness. He hadn't planned to be here for this, but the mechanical rhythm of the delivery was already unfolding. One of his drivers stood by the rear doors, keys in hand, appearing to wait for direction rather than moving ahead with the offload. Before the man could start, the supervisor stepped in and stopped him with a small, firm gesture, then leaned over the cart, pulling 2 heavy bundles forward and pushing others back into the frame. "These go first," she said, her voice dropping into a tone that left no room for debate. The driver nodded without asking why, and as he began loading, another staff member stepped in behind him a moment later to adjust the order again, making sure the top layer was positioned for an easy, immediate grab. The supervisor watched the sequence to completion, ensuring the placement was perfect, before she leaned slightly toward Kene. "We arrange the linens based on how they will be used the moment they arrive, not based on how they are transported in the truck," she said. "What we want is a delivery that arrives in a way our staff can use immediately, without needing to sort, reorganize, or check anything before putting it into service." Off to the side, after a brief lull in movement, a housekeeper approached holding a single pillowcase. "This one came back," she said, her voice low. "It looks clean, but it does not match the rest." She held it up briefly, then pressed it against another from the stack. The difference was slight, but visible when placed side by side. The supervisor glanced at it, nodded once, and sent it back through without stopping the flow. The housekeeper exhaled as she turned away, her shoulders dropping slightly as she stepped back into her work. "I do not want to explain this to a guest," she said under her breath. The supervisor looked toward Tunde and Kene, then spoke quietly, keeping her tone steady. "When something like that reaches the floor, my staff has to stop what they are doing and explain why it does not match," she said. "What we want is for every item in a set to be consistent so it can be used immediately, without comparison, without hesitation, and without explanation." Further along, a staff member paused mid-step, looking at a bundle in his hands, then turned back to the cart to swap it out before continuing. The supervisor followed the motion with her eyes. "No one asked him to do that," she said. "He corrected it because he knows it will be noticed later." She let the moment settle before continuing. "What we want is a standard that holds before it reaches us, so my team does not have to keep checking, adjusting, or second-guessing what has already been delivered." The movement was small, but it repeated itself across the room. Nothing left the bay without being adjusted, checked, or reordered at least once. As they stepped back from the flow, Tunde let out a quiet breath, weighing the meaning behind what they had just seen. He shifted his grip on the legal pad in his hand, jotting down a few quick lines before speaking, his voice kept low so it would not carry beyond Kene. "You heard it," he said. "What presses them is not the workload itself, but the uncertainty around it." He glanced toward the loading bay, where the supervisor was already redirecting 2 staff members, then wrote again, capturing the sequence as he spoke. "It seems they never know which item will run out first, which guest will extend a stay, which stain will get flagged, or when a department will call for something last minute. It is the guessing that wears them down." He paused, pen still against the page, then corrected himself with more precision, almost as if refining the line he was writing. "They want the removal of guessing. They want predictability without having to think about it." Kene, standing beside him with his own notes, followed the line of thought without looking up immediately, adding to the page before responding in the same lowered tone. "They are not asking for speed," he said. "They want certainty. They want items that arrive ready, match each other, and can be used immediately. They want delivery that fits the exact moment it is needed. They want a buffer that absorbs the unexpected before it derails their morning." Tunde considered that, writing it down as the idea sharpened through the act of saying it aloud. "If we delivered that, we would not just be handling linens. We would be protecting how their day holds together." He paused, then glanced back once more at the supervisor coordinating her team, adding one final line to his notes. "They want their operation to hold without disruption, even when reality shifts around them." It was the kind of insight that never surfaced in a meeting room, but revealed itself only when people spoke from the strain of their actual work. The hardening of expectations. They did not rush their exit. Instead, they let the minutes stretch into hours, remaining quietly in the background as they moved beyond the immediate noise of the loading bay. They drifted through the adjacent corridors, into the cramped storage rooms, and onto the steady hum of the service elevators, watching how expectations carried across parts of the building they had not first considered. At intervals, both men paused to write, their legal pads filling with short, deliberate lines that captured the specific outcomes customers were trying to secure but never stated in a formal request. They began to notice that individual departments wanted their own sense of control over the timing of their supply rather than depending on a central flow, and that managers were looking for clear visibility into exactly what was coming before the truck even arrived. They saw that the floor staff simply wanted the confidence that what they requested in the morning would match exactly what showed up in the afternoon, without any need to trace errors back through the system. In the quieter moments between deliveries, they picked up on something even more subtle, the way different roles within the building required entirely different forms of assurance. For some, the priority was tied to sheer speed. For others, it was the precision of the fold, and for the administrators, it was a strict sense of accountability that held firm without any need for negotiation. By the time they finally stepped away, they were no longer observing a single operation, but a layered set of wants that varied by role, timing, and responsibility, all of which were already shaping what the service would be required to deliver. Finally making their way back in the truck, surrounded by the evening bustle of hotel staff and drivers, Kene replayed the supervisor's quiet wishes in his mind. It stood out because it had not been frustration but imagination, a small glimpse of what the market might demand long before anyone admitted it aloud. That morning pickup she described had sounded like a luxury, a tiny rescue run meant to steady a chaotic shift, yet he had seen how these ideas evolved. He recognized the pattern not from this visit alone, but from years of watching similar requests surface across his own operations, first as isolated remarks, then as repeated preferences, and eventually as non-negotiable expectations clients assumed would be met without discussion. Quiet wishes repeated themselves, then hardened into expectations, and eventually solidified into requirements that no vendor could survive without meeting. To him, wants were never noise. They were early warnings, the first outlines of the systems the next decade would require. He began to map them more clearly now, not as scattered observations, but as a pattern taking shape. They wanted certainty that removed exposure, timing that adapted to reality, and consistency that held under pressure. Listening closely had never been optional. It was how he had learned to see the future taking shape while everyone else was still arguing about the present. They stepped out of the hotel into the mid-afternoon heat, the noise of traffic folding back in around them. Tunde made a quick call as they walked back to the company vehicle, confirming the next visit without slowing his pace. The drive was shorter this time, quieter, the city shifting from commercial bustle to something more contained as they pulled up. Their next stop was a private hospital that ran on a noticeably heavier morning rhythm. A junior attendant met them at the entrance and led them through a narrow corridor toward the laundry holding room. "This way," he said, glancing back once as a cart rolled past, a nurse steadying a stack of folded garments with one hand. Inside the room, two nurses were already at the table, sorting a growing pile of clean garments. One lifted a bundle, scanned the tag, then shifted it aside. "No, these go to emergency," she said. The other reached across, pulling a separate stack closer. "We are mixing again," she muttered, adjusting the order. The matron looked up when she saw them and stepped forward. "We appreciate you coming by," she said, moving slightly aside to clear space. "This hour shows you what we need to work properly." She picked up a stack of surgical scrubs, then set it down again. "The cleaning is fine. Always has been. But watch this." She turned toward the nurses. "Where do these go?" "Lab," one replied without looking up. "And these?" "Maternity," the other answered, already separating them. The matron let the moment sit. When everything arrives together, they cannot use it right away. They have to stop and separate it before they can move. She tapped a tag lightly. "Lab needs theirs early. Emergency cycles constantly. Maternity later." She looked back at Tunde. "What we want is for each unit to receive what it needs, at the moment it needs it, already separated and ready to go." One nurse glanced at the clock, then kept working. The matron nodded slightly. Not one delivery, the right delivery at the right moment. The pulse of synchronization. As they continued toward the next wing, the hallway narrowed, and a nurse emerged from a side room, pushing a cart piled high with folded scrubs. The stack leaned as she turned the corner, forcing her to pause and press the garments back into place. Another nurse stepped out to steady the top layer as she helped guide the cart. "If these came when the shift teams actually settle in," the first nurse murmured to her colleague, adjusting the scrubs again, "people could just grab what they need and get straight to their stations." She spoke softly, more focused on keeping the stack from spilling than on being overheard, and the two of them continued down the hall with the cart balanced between them. Kene slowed slightly, watching the exchange without interrupting it. "Did you hear it?" he said quietly. Tunde nodded, still looking down the corridor. "Timing," he said. "They want timing." Kene gave a small nod. "Yes, but stay disciplined." He turned slightly toward him as they walked. "We are not solving anything yet. We are not designing anything. What we walk away with today is clarity, not conclusions." Tunde glanced over. "Clarity of what?" Kene answered without hesitation. "Structured wants. A clean map of what they want, expressed in outcome language, without attaching how to fix it." He let the words settle, then continued. "Every observation we make, every complaint, delay, workaround, or behavior, we translate it. We say it directly. They want this. They increasingly expect this. They no longer tolerate this. Nothing else." Tunde frowned slightly. "So no ideas yet." "No ideas," Kene said. "If we move too early, we contaminate it. We stay with the signal." He gestured subtly toward the corridor ahead. "What you just saw. Do not turn it into a service. Say it clean." Tunde nodded once. "They want delivery that aligns with when they actually start their shifts." Kene gave a brief look of approval. "Good. That is the work. Capture it, label it, let the pattern build. The system will come later." The moment passed quickly. A small exchange almost swallowed by the movement of the hospital. But it left its trace. As the mid-afternoon wore on and gave way to the early hours of evening, the pace did not break, it shifted, and with it, the patterns became more visible. Tunde watched the understated sentiment giving shape to a different kind of possibility. But he held it back now, resisting the urge to build. His teams dropping off laundry was one thing, but what stayed with him was not the solution. It was the signal. They wanted alignment with how their day actually unfolded. As they continued moving through the floor over time, that signal widened. In one unit, items were set aside not because they were wrong, but because they arrived too early to be useful. In another, a nurse held onto a bundle longer than needed, waiting for the rest of the set to match before moving forward. In a side room, a staff member checked a label again before handing it off, not out of confusion, but out of expectation that it should already be right. None of it was announced, yet each moment, spaced out across the passing hours, pointed to a different dimension of what they were trying to secure. They wanted timing that matched their specific window, not a general schedule. They wanted sets that arrived complete, not pieced together across multiple handoffs. They wanted confidence that what they received could move forward immediately within their own responsibilities, without forcing them to pause, wait, or compensate. The pattern was no longer tied to a single interaction or department. It revealed itself gradually, as the afternoon stretched into evening, and how each role shaped the service to fit its own rhythm, quietly reinforcing what the system would eventually be required to deliver. The scene settled into his mind as another clear expression of demand, something forming ahead of articulation, something that would repeat if he kept listening. The architecture of anticipation. Driving back toward the mainland, the city lights flickered onto the windshields of passing cars as the noise of the hospital faded behind them. The day had closed. Neither of them spoke for a while, the movement of the car giving space for what they had seen to settle into something more coherent. Kene leaned back slightly, not replaying individual moments, but tracing the pattern that had formed across both sites. "It is consistent," he said quietly. "They are not asking for more service. They are asking for service that fits exactly into how their work already moves." Tunde nodded, his gaze still forward. "They want it to arrive in a way that removes decisions," he said. "No sorting, no checking, no adjusting. It just fits." Kene continued, his tone steady. "And it changes depending on where you stand. Each role defines that fit differently, but all of them expect it to hold without explanation." Tunde let that sit for a moment. "So it is not speed," he said. "It is alignment." Kene gave a small nod. "Alignment that holds under pressure," he said. "Once that becomes expected, anything less will feel like failure." The truck interior shielded from the heat of the Lagos evening by the hum of the air conditioning as Kene flipped through the pages of his legal pad. Tunde kept his eyes on the brake lights ahead, but his mind was tracing the full arc of the day, from the hotel's frantic loading bay to the hospital's sterile, high-pressure corridors. "It is the same signal everywhere," he said, breaking the silence. "The matron sorting through scrubs is just trying to secure a specific end state where her morning doesn't collapse because of a gap we left." Kene nodded, his thumb tracing a specific line he had jotted down under the dome light. "Exactly. You're seeing the shadow work, the invisible labor the customer performs to secure the outcome they actually value, whether they are refolding for guest presentation or sorting for clinical survival. Kene tilted the pad to catch the passing streetlights, pointing to a margin note. But did you notice the junior attendant at the entrance? My notes show he wasn't just leading us, he was checking the lint on the floor. There is a growing want for environmental hygiene that goes beyond the linen itself, an expectation for the service to feel sterile as a total outcome before it even touches the ward. Kene shifted in his seat, his voice low and steady as he tapped a final observation. And notice how the nurses didn't just check the tags for accuracy, they checked them for accountability. They aren't just looking for clean clothes anymore. They want a system that carries its own proof of quality so they can secure the outcome of not having to defend themselves to the doctors or the guests. Tunde exhaled, the full weight of the day's observations finally layering into a single realization. So the want isn't just the delivery. It's the removal of the professional risk they feel and outcome they are moving toward, even if they haven't said it directly. Kene gave a single, sharp nod, closing the pad with a finality that echoed in the truck. Now you are seeing the map. We saw the friction, but we also saw the layered set of wants they are trying to secure. That is the signal we take back. When they returned to the office, Kene didn't write strategy. He didn't interpret the day as a business problem. He stayed disciplined. He documented wants. He wrote the exact phrases people used when describing delays. He translated them cleanly. They want flexibility under unexpected demand. They want consistency that holds under scrutiny. They want timing that aligns with real workflow. They want reliability that removes exposure. He wrote down the body language, the clenched jaw of the front desk worker, the careful hands of the matron, the defensive stance of the housekeeping trainee. He wrote how quickly reactions surfaced. He wrote how quietly pressure showed in the clinic. He wrote how expectations had moved from on time to unbreakable consistency. These were not observations about tools or lifestyle or regulation. They were demand signals, expressed as outcomes customers were trying to secure. By the time he stopped, he had pages filled not with ideas but with clearly labeled wants, grounded in behavior, pressure, and repetition. The pattern was no longer scattered. It was forming. That day clarified one truth. Customer wants were not revealed by asking. They were revealed by what people increasingly expected, what they returned for, and what they no longer tolerated. The next day would move to a different dimension entirely. But day one closed cleanly, with a structured map of shifting wants, real, observable, and already shaping the next 5 years of the industry.